Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for what I think will be a very, very interesting event here at Carnegie Online. My name is Dr. Hellyer. I'm a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I'm really delighted that we're able to have this session today. We've been thinking about it for quite some time. It comes at a very opportune time, just in terms of historical events being remembered at this particular moment in history, and I'm really quite excited about today, and I hope you are as well. It's been 30 years since the release of Nelson Mandela and the beginning of the end to the authoritarianism of South Africa and its apartheid regime. And it's also been 10 years this month since the beginning of the Arab Spring uprisings, which many of us call the Arab awakening of the 21st century. And both of these events have really very special personal resonance for myself. My father, as a young man, was in the Young Liberal movement in the UK, an activist in the anti-apartheid movement. And growing up, I remember very clearly him having that clear commitment to that particular struggle. And when apartheid finally fell in the 90s, I remember he had a sense of deep satisfaction for that on the one hand, and a sense of forlornness on the other, because the other major political struggle he was involved in was in the Palestine solidarity movement, and there wasn't the same kind of success there. And when it came to the Arab Spring, I was actually in Egypt when before the uprisings began, throughout the time of the uprisings, and I stayed in the region throughout much of the following decade. And I remember personally being in Tahrir Square in 2011. I remember engaging analytically on the Libyan uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, the Syrian uprising against the Assad regime, and focusing a great deal of my energies during that time. But as much as I supported and as much as I remember the revolutionary uprisings, and I'm personally very grateful for having been able to witness them, I also saw the counter-revolutionary waves that took place really from 2013 onwards across the region. The counter-revolutionary waves that really went a great deal to try to undo and unwind everything that had happened. And a decade on, I think it's not that the story is necessarily over, but certainly in many places where we thought there would be a slow but constant progression towards more accountable government, we've had a different outcome entirely. So today we wanted to have a discussion, again, decades after Nelson Mandela's release, a decade from the start of the Arab Spring, a discussion around what lessons can we draw from South Africa as the Middle East continues to seek stability, but in a comprehensive way, as opposed to a purely securitized kind of way. And as people across the world and in the region more particularly confront rising authoritarianism, how can these important moments in history be guiding lights for lasting change? So we have three very special guests with us today. I'm delighted that they were able to make time to be with us today. And you have the bios on the website, but if I can just say briefly, our first guest, Shafiq Morton, is someone I've known for many years now. Somebody who was a journalist during the anti-apartheid era, a photojournalist, an activist, a supporter of the anti-apartheid struggle, but also so someone who covered that struggle a lot in the 80s and the 90s, but then also covered the Arab world a great deal as well. Somebody who I'm really delighted to have here. And I want to start with you, Shafiq, to give us something of a bird's eye view kind of way. And I want the audience to recognize that you're actually a very unique character in all of this. You're originally from the white English community of South Africa. You're not originally from any minority community in South Africa. And then you make a concerted choice in the 1970s. You become an active supporter of the United Democratic Front, which was linked to the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela. You reported on the struggle as a journalist, and you saw the dismantling of apartheid. but you're also someone deeply connected to the Arab world. You're somebody who wrote a book on Palestine. You're somebody who was in Libya during the uprising. You followed events in Egypt, I know very closely. We've discussed that many times. You're a keen observer of Saudi. So I think there's a very interesting and intriguing story there, and I want to explore it with you a bit. But here's the first question I wanted to throw in your direction. And I remember, as someone part Egyptian, that when I traveled post 2011, when people asked where you from, and I would say Egypt, they'd be all, wow. And now if I say that, people will say, oh, the reaction has changed completely. And I think that's true also about how even Libyans were spoken to for a while, less so perhaps in other parts of the uprising era. And a friend commented to me recently, that's about how South Africans, I think, had it as well. When apartheid was overcome, I guess it would have been many years thereafter, people would have said, "Oh, wow, you're from South Africa and you've done this incredible thing." But then people stopped saying that because of the economic situation, the political situation, and kind of means the world's attention wanes. There's a disillusionment of a certain type that sets in, and that has an effect. And because when the world's attention ceases, then the powers that be at home in these different nations begin to feel perhaps something more of an empowerment to do as they please. And I think that's certainly true across the Arab Spring countries, with the exception of Tunisia. Authoritarianism and autocracy, they like the shadows. They seldom invite the bright lights of day, even if they'll do what they want to do anyway. And I want to understand from you, is that how you saw the treatment of South Africa after a while? And how did that affect how the furthering of the struggle after apartheid went on? And as you reflect on that, how do you think that might look differently or the same in Arab Spring countries today?
Now, first of all, good afternoon to Bell. Good morning to Bell. Good afternoon to Ebrahim and to Hisham. Hope you guys are all good. Hisham, this is a long question you've asked me. It's quite complex, but I'll try and make it as simple as possible. From a media aspect, from a media view, the South African story, like so many dramatic stories, started off on page one with the release of Nelson Mandela from prison after a period of 27 years. It was a dramatic event, and the events that followed on afterwards, Mandela released in 1990, and of course the first democratic elections in 1994, a dramatic historical period in South African history. And of course, the media was very interested. Let me give you a quick footnote. So the interesting reason why there was such wall-to-wall coverage, particularly in 1994, is that a lot of the wire services and networks that were in South Africa in late March 1994 were telling us that they were expecting us to explode into a civil war. So they were battening down their hatches in Johannesburg, and their satellite dishes were going up. This is what they thought they were going to cover. As we know, the South African story unfolded in a very different way, although there were some very dramatic events, and it was touch and go at times. The IFP party coming in at the last minute in 1994, and the right-wing threat that the government experienced, as well as the assassination of Chris Hani. Okay, I'm covering a lot of territory. What happens in these stories, and this is only from a media viewpoint, you go from page 1 to page 3 to page 5 to page 9 to page 11, and then your story disappears unless there's something that's dramatic, unless there's something that's going to make a very sexy headline. So what happens in the South African instance is you move from being a story of triumph to one of where the hard work has to begin. So you become a developing state in a period of transition, and the real issues that come to the fore now are economic ones, developmental ones, human rights issues, the issue of the independence of the judiciary, etc. And these are not as sexy as the drama of Nelson Mandela walking out of prison or the long queues of the 1994 elections. Having said all of that, I feel that comparisons between what has happened in South Africa can only be made in terms of media. When Tahrir Square was full of so many people and Al Jazeera had the cameras permanently on what was happening there, yes, it was in the mainstream. It was catching everybody's attention. But you can only maintain headline focus or primetime focus on a topic for so long because your audiences start to drift away. And this is, from a media viewpoint, essentially what has happened in the so-called Arab uprising states. The political narrative, of course, is completely different, and that's quite a complex one. I'm going to finish now. In South Africa, for example, we didn't have so many foreign players as we had support. I mean, the non-aligned movement supported South Africa, African states supported South Africa. The only problems, quote unquote, were the conservative politicians in the UK and the United States who saw us as terrorists, and we had to graduate from being terrorists to Democrats. I know that Mr. Rasool, Ebrahim, will know a lot about that particular narrative as he spent a lot of time in the US. So it is a complex story. So I would say media narrative, which is slightly different to the political narrative, and the political narrative of the Arab uprising is very difficult to put into a thimble because was not homogenous. Tunisia was different to Egypt. Egypt was different to Yemen. Yemen is different to Syria, and so you go along the line. Yemen as well. All different dynamics, but the one thing that is common, and this is where I'll end this question, is that in all the states, including South Africa, you've got a youth bulge. You've got an expectancy from the youth about their future. They want to have access to power, and they want to have access to the economy, and that's where the question starts.
Thank you so much for that, Shafiq, to give us, that opening sort of a salvo on these sorts of things, and also something that I hope we can come back to later on in this conversation is indeed the fact that when it came to South Africa, support was far more general. I think across the world, you had the entirety of the African continent. You had many the non-aligned movement and many solidarity movements around the world. The situation was quite different, particularly in the immediate region of the Arab world where these uprisings were taking place. And we'll get to that, I think, later on in terms of the different axes of power at the time, but also how they develop over years thereafter. So we'll come back to that. And I would like to go on, and we'll come back to ask you several more questions, but I'd like to go on to Ebrahim Rasool. Ambassador Rasool, welcome today. It's always a pleasure to see you. I can't go into your entire sort of list of accomplishments over the decades, but if I can just explain to everybody that you are the former ambassador of South Africa to the United States, and you held senior positions in the ANC, the African National Congress, during and after the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. And one thing that I thought was very interesting about today's discussion is that we have somebody who, yes, indeed, was very involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, but also was very familiar with the Arab world and the wider MENA region, which gives you a particular perspective that I think few others, even within South Africa, would be able to match. So I thank you for coming to this session today. So you did go through the struggle, and at the same time, you did so very consciously as a South African, but also as a member of the Muslim community, and very consciously so. And none of that held you back in the struggle at all. And you linked to other Muslims internationally, particularly, let's say, politically activist orientated Muslims in the Arab world and elsewhere. So even when you moved to DC as your country's ambassador, you had quite a connection to Muslim communities in the US who still miss you. I know, they tell me. So I think they'll be very happy to see you today. But you also took a very deep and keen interest in what was happening in the Arab world during the uprising years in particular, and the fight there against authoritarianism amidst that particular period. So please tell us more about that. How did your experience in the struggle in the 70s and the 80s, and the beginning of the 90s? How did that inform you? How did you see what was unfolding within the Arab world?
Well, thank you very much, Hisham, and thanks very much to Bel and Shafiq, and greetings to you all. I want to say that, the year that I entered high school was 1976. That was the year of the student uprisings, starting off in Soweto and then going across the country. And that was the year I've had my first taste of tear gas, of rubber bullets, and of police whips, and so forth, as a standard 6 or grade 8 student. The year that I left high school was the year of the 12-week school boycotts, of which I was a leader both at my school and as a member of the committee of 81. So politics is not a choice. Politics is just an accident that can easily befall a South African going about their ordinary life. It's not a career. It is just something that you fall into. And at the same time, I had been steeped in madrasa education. I had been at the madrasa learning to read the Quran and learning how to clean myself and fiqh and all of those kind of things from the age of 3. It was like the aftercare of choice for Muslims, that your son comes from the school and he goes to the madrasa and someone takes care of him. And so you've always had this kind of double identity. And I make it a double identity in the sense that the two worlds rarely came together. In a sense, you had your political activism at school, and you went about your business as a Muslim, and the two didn't meet. And that's when I think we got introduced to Islamism in the sense of the Ikhwani influence in South Africa, which said read the Quran in English, and that was a revolutionary act. Think for yourself, ijtihad is okay. And so I'm forever grateful for that kind of influence that liberated me from intermediaries between myself and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I think, and that's when we started reading, and we thought that everything we were doing in the political terrain, leading the school boycotts, confronting the police, standing up to tear gas, rubber bullets, fearing to be jailed and so forth, these are things that the Quran is full of. And so in a sense, the two personas started to come together. And we then understood that how do we not only be a general liberator for all the people of South Africa, but how do you also fulfill your responsibility to liberate the community from which you come, so that they are not just liberated in the political sense, but they are also liberated in the theological, intellectual sense. So you almost get into a double struggle. The ability to get your own people to live up to the values of Islam, while at the same time fighting oppression and the repression of apartheid and for human dignity. And so in a sense, that umbilical cord on the Muslim side to the Muslim world created a natural curiosity about what was then wrong. Why can a majority of Muslims across the Arab world particularly not see that there's a reality beyond kings, beyond dictators, beyond single-party states, beyond authoritarianism, beyond misogyny, beyond this, that, and the other. And so in a sense, those connections are fairly natural ones. And of course, the animating thing about the Middle East is the identification in South Africa with Palestine. And so you always know that Mandela and Arafat were soulmates. We always knew that Mandela and Ben Bella cooperated for the first training of the ANC's guerrilla army in Algeria. You always knew that Arab countries were, despite their own authoritarianism, they were contributing to the struggle in South Africa. And that's a contradiction you try to work out. And you've got to work it out in a way that you don't create a contradiction. You don't fight so hard against universal authoritarianism, even in the Arab world, at the expense of getting financial support. In the same way you see the excesses of communism, but you know the Soviet Union was the only place that fed your soldiers. And so it's about managing those contradictions And I think that what 2011 represented, when that moment arose, you almost began to feel that the contradictions could subside, that you could now speak about a universal code of values, of rights, of freedoms, of democracy, and all of those kind of matters. So in a sense, I was shaped by the double identity, which increasingly converged into a single identity. And it is the battle for tawheed, for unity, of integration in that kind of sense that I think we were very, very adept at. And so there was this natural umbilical cord. And when we saw the limitations, for example, of Islamism, when we wanted to take our struggle to a new level, to affiliate to the liberation movement, to affiliate to Desmond Tutu's interfaith movement, and Islamism tried to hold you back, then you said, no, this is the time to transcend it. It's not fulfilling its human and divine purpose, and it's better to step out of it and to grow on your own. And that's when we formed the Call of Islam. That's when we formed a Call of Islam that immediately affiliated to both the liberation and the interfaith movements. And that's when I think you shaped a generation of Tawhidi people, integrated completely and not living those kind of disjointed lives and fragmented lives.
So that, I mean, that's incredible to hear about. So Ebrahim, maybe you could, or somebody needs to turn off their mic. But the combination, I think, that you have of those experiences, how did that also lead you in your analysis of what was going on in the Arab world in 2011 onwards? Because, as I said, you have a huge sort of resource to draw on, not simply as somebody who was involved in an anti-authoritarianism struggle, but someone who, as you say, had a close affinity with different struggles in the Arab world. How did that inform you?
Look, I think that it informed me because I remember in the middle of 2011, I got a letter from someone called Muhammad Mursi, who said he was the leader of the Freedom and Justice Party and he wanted me to come to Egypt. And I said to him in reply that I've transcended Islamism and I'm the ambassador. Cut a long story short, that's how I entered January 2012 into Egypt, sat down with the Ikhwan, sat down with the Freedom and Justice Party, and really worked through particularly the transitional lessons from South Africa. And I kept on stressing that the hikmah, the wisdom of a Nelson Mandela was that your first priority in a transition is to prevent counter-revolution. Whatever other ideals you have, you cannot meet your ideals if you do not prevent counter-revolution. And that preventing counter-revolution may involve compromises, but is not a compromise by itself. It is a revolutionary duty to do that. And part of that logic that we try to impart, and in some cases like Tunisia, Sheikh Hanoushi listened, Mursi did not. But the first one is to accept that the other, your former enemy, is here to stay. You can't wish them away. Secondly, start with the vision that the ANC had articulated in 1955 already. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, that you've got to construct a diverse society of divergent people, ideologies, beliefs, and thoughts. That you've got to move from that point and to understand the fundamental wisdom that you don't destroy what you want to inherit. If you want to inherit Egypt, you cannot have a zero-sum game. You've got to nurture it. You've got to isolate only the extremes and unite the middle ground. So we would ask ourselves, who were the forces for change and who were the forces who died for the status quo? And that calculation of the balance of forces is so important because someone may differ with you in terms of theology. Someone may differ with you in terms of ideology, liberal versus. But if they are broadly the forces for change, you find common cause with them. And only the extremes on both sides need to be isolated, if not defeated. And I think that it's this strategic wisdom that I try to impart, because without it, counter-revolution was always, I mean, Mandela went to Oranje, a little enclave of led by the wife of the architect of apartheid, Betsy Verwoerd, to have tea with her. He made gestures to his jailers. He created sunset clauses for the National Party government. And we live with those compromises today. But as I would always say, and I end on this note, I would rather be thinking 26 years later how to equalize, how to non-racialize South Africa, than either be in jail or be dying in jail. Because to be able to think through it from Parliament, from inside cabinet, from the citadels of government, is infinitely better than the glorious death that you have in the cells and the jails of Egypt or wherever it may be.
You know, it's fascinating that you use that phrase, zero-sum game, because it's one that I've heard time and time again when it comes to the past decade, that, you know, it's not what happened in Tunisia, because there was never that option because of the way that power was distributed. So a zero-sum game was just never possible. And that's why I think it was able to go the way that it did. Whereas elsewhere, that certainly has not been the case. And when a zero-sum game is the game, then, you know, you're going to have a huge upset that's going to be very destructive indeed. We'll come back to that, I think. But I'd like to go on now to Bell Chu, who's the Middle East correspondent for The Independent, who's been a Middle East correspondent since before the Arab uprisings. And you, like me, Bell, witnessed the events of 2011 firsthand, particularly when it came to Egypt. But you're not a stranger to the region even before then. You were born in the region. You were raised in the region. You've worked in the region your entire adult life. And I remember us meeting actually when you were covering the Egyptian uprising and its aftermath in 2011. And you went on to be the Times correspondent in the region and then the Independence. Like myself, you're a Brit, but with someone with deep, deep connections in the region. And you've traveled all around it and covered so much of it. So a decade on from the beginning of this tumultuous era, what strikes you the most about the changes in the region? And I also want to ask you that droll question, which we all have to prepare to answer for over the coming weeks, now that the 10th anniversary is upon us. Have things gone back to the way they were pre-revolution? And if not, how?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me today and joining this excellent panel. And I would say my first sort of initial response to that question is perhaps not so much an analytical one, but an emotional one. I'd say the biggest sort of difference I've seen in the region is the sort of profound loss of hope since 2011. I mean, I think anyone who was there on the streets in Tahrir or in Libya or in Syria, who were on, you know, even in the darkest moments of the uprisings, would have felt that sort of crackling electricity of potential and the immense amount of sort of civic engagement. I mean, I remember being in Egypt and every single ahwa was packed with people discussing how they wanted the parliamentary elections to be or what they wanted in the constitution. And that hope was echoed across many different parts of the region that, you know, that did have these uprisings. And that's obviously changed because the situation in many of these places, even Tunisia, which is regarded as the sort of success story of the Arab Spring, you know, what people wanted has not been delivered. And in that, you've also seen, which is more worrying almost, is the complete loss of a generation, specifically for countries like Syria. You know, I speak regularly to people who were 11 years old or 10 years old when the Arab Spring started, the Arab uprising started. They're now in their early 20s. They've never been to school. And there's a couple of people I'm specifically thinking of right now. You know, the only way to make money is to fight. And they're now mercenaries and are deployed to places like Azerbaijan and Libya on the behalf, in this specific instance of Turkey. And that brings me into my second point. So the sort of immediate response to you is the kind of emotional one, the loss of hope. But I think in terms of kind of an analysis of how I've seen the region change over the last 10 years has been the, and I don't know if this is actually a word, but the kind of internationalization of the conflicts. So in 2011, I'm sure everyone here would agree, there was this almost rejection of, Pan-Arabism or Pan-Africanism. There was an emphasis in each country on being specifically Egyptian, on being Libyan, and what it means to be Syrian. People were reclaiming their flags. They were reclaiming their nationalities. That could sometimes be quite fraught. People who maybe whose Arabic wasn't very good, or were dual nationals, or who'd been in exile, found that quite complicated when they came back to their uprisings. And the regimes, of course, the authoritarian regimes used this against protesters, claiming that they were influenced by the foreign hand or whatever it was. But at the time, it was very much about what does it mean to be Egyptian and what do Egyptians need? What does it mean to be Libyan? How can we imagine the future of this country for them? How that's changed right now is we've seen basically, and I know we're going to talk about these axes of power later on in this discussion, but we're seeing the massive internet, it's turned into an enormous international playground, specifically one involved in conflict. This theatre of war involves multiple different countries, both within the region, but also countries outside, like Russia, obviously playing a major role in Syria. And that has meant that really decision-making has been ripped out of the hands of the people here on the ground for each country and placed in the hands of the superpowers in the region and what they see to be, best for their interests. And the second part of the question you're asking me is, do I think that we're seeing a return to pre-revolution times? I don't think so, but I don't think I think it's worse. I think we're seeing not across the entire region, but I think, in terms of just all the indicators, the situation in all of these countries is basically more miserable for the people on the ground. Extreme poverty rates nearly doubled between 2015 and 2018 across the Middle East and North Africa, largely driven by the conflicts in Syria and Yemen. In Syria, we saw the creation of basically the largest refugee displacement crisis since the Second World War. Talking about Yemen, it's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. The UN is predicting that by mid next year, there'll be 16.2 million people going hungry. Rates of number of people in famine-like conditions will triple. The numbers are huge. And of course, we look at something like Egypt. People are suffocated. It's almost impossible to operate on the ground as a journalist, as an independent journalist, or in civil society. We've seen that recently with the crackdown on the Egyptian Initiative of Personal Rights. 3 staff has been arrested, which got the attention of the world, but still, that doesn't, just because they were free doesn't mean that there is freedom in Egypt. I think it would be safe to say that in terms of curtailment of freedoms, it's worse, at least, than the last few years of the Mubarak era, where there was some opening of some space. And if you look at a country like Libya, it's such a confusing mess with so many countries with their fingers in the Libyan pie that it's very hard to see how people, the Libyans, can extricate themselves from that kind of conflict. So for me, I'd say that the situation is different. We're seeing different kinds of authoritarian regimes, but ultimately the indicators, poverty levels, hunger levels, freedom levels, all of those have decreased, have gone down and become more miserable since before 2011, and that, is coupled with the loss of hope of change. And it's as someone, who covers the region very closely, it's extremely sad to see that, and I don't really see how that's going to change. And the other major change in the region, I would say probably in the last 10 years, just to add as an aside, is the return to maybe older conflicts that were put to the side because the Arab Spring, or the uprisings, however you want to refer to it, basically impacted the kind of geopolitics of the region. So I mean specifically things like the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is becoming more important now in terms of how it's impacting the region, not necessarily because of the actual conflict itself, but through, of course, these recent diplomatic deals. And then on top of that, the aftermath of the invasion, or the US invasion of Iraq, we're seeing that bubbling to the surface as well. So it's almost like a lot of places, the Arab Spring uprisings, have changed so much, and it's moved on so much in the last 10 years, is that they're not even relevant anymore. And at the same time, there's just an immense loss of hope, a lost generation, and horrible levels of lack of freedoms and hunger and abject poverty. So it's a pretty bleak outlook, I would say.
So thank you, Belle, and I really appreciate that you brought in how some things have changed and some things have not changed. And one of the things that seems to have come back to the forefront is indeed the Palestine question. And it's something I wanted to pose to Shafiq. Shafiq, we will be coming back to some of the other things that you discussed, Belle, especially about how the internationalization, as you put it, of the conflicts have really deepened and widened, these different axes that we'll talk about. But I want to touch on that in particular because, when we talk about South Africa, we know a particular word, right? That word is apartheid. And we're discussing these two particular moments in history, 30 years post Mandela's release, where he wages his struggle against apartheid, 10 years post the beginning of the Arab uprisings, which at their core were struggles against authoritarianism and autocracy. But that word apartheid has a legal definition, crystallized at the United Nations. And if we're looking at the Arab world, there's one place where this word is mentioned time and again, and that's by Palestinians in reference to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And at the UN, I know this month they're beginning a campaign, or rather a bunch of human rights organizations are beginning a campaign to designate what's going on in the West Bank in particular as a form of apartheid under the internationally defined definition of apartheid. And actually, I think there's a page somewhere that I was sent, which they shortened to tinyurl.com/palcamp, so Palestinian campaign, which talks about how they see it as such. And it raises an interesting question. When we're now approaching 2021, it's a decade post the Arab uprisings, but also is when I think we see the calculus in the region moving in a particular way, where these normalization efforts are being pushed left, right, and center, sometimes in ways that are different from others. I'm particularly thinking about Sudan, where really the Trump administration really sort of forced that one through. And it was very obvious to people who were watching Khartoum that wasn't exactly what they would have liked. But this was the nature of how Secretary of State Pompeo and the Trump administration are moving forward. But as somebody, Shafiq, who wrote on Palestine so much, still follows it now, has been throughout the West Bank many times and in other parts of the Palestinian territories. You lived through the anti-apartheid struggle. You saw apartheid up front and personal. Is this what's going on, in your opinion, as somebody who lived through that period in your country's history, struggled against it? How do you see that part of the world?
Well, I mean, I would agree with the sentiments of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for example, who has expressly said that what we're dealing with in places such as West Bank is apartheid, uppercase. If you have a look at the definition of apartheid, the South African euphemism was separate development. The reality is systematic oppression, where race is involved. That's sort of the generic definition, which was determined by South Africa in 1966 in the UN. How I understood it was, if you look at the notion of a Bantustan, South African apartheid system, one of the primary mechanisms that it used was the issue of land. So you had about 85% of the indigenous population in South Africa in the policies being forced onto less than 15% of the land into pseudo-independent, pseudo-autonomous entities called Bantustans. And in South Africa, there were about 10 Bantustans, and what people often forget is in the neighboring state of Namibia, South Africa also practiced the Bantustan policy as well. So what you have is you have these pseudo-states, these pseudo-entities marketed as being independent. If you travel to the West Bank, and I'm going to use the 1967 borders of the West Bank, which is about 6,000 square kilometers, the reality in the West Bank right now is you have an occupation that is deemed illegal by the United Nations. So this is not just whim or fancy talking in terms of that. You have 230 settlements in that area which are regarded as illegal by international law, 400,000 settlers who shouldn't be there in terms of the land belonging to the indigenous inhabitants who are Palestinian. Another dynamic of the South African struggle was you were considered a foreigner in the land of your birth. And this is the fast encroaching reality upon Palestinians in places such as the West Bank. Because if you carry a West Bank dompas or a pass, you are not going to be able to travel to Jerusalem, for example. You're not, for example, be able to go to visit Masjid al-Aqsa or any of the holy places, as an anecdotal example. But if you look closer at the West Bank, you will notice at the moment there are about 25 different enclaves, 25 what you could classify as Bantustan, separate entities in the West Bank, some of them walled off. And of course, the aggravation, a layer of the aggravation there is you've got about 200 checkpoints, some of them what they call flying checkpoints, which can be put up wherever you feel like it. So those are the dynamics you're looking at in the West Bank. You've got an indigenous population separated in many instances from the land of its birth, forced into small little pockets of land. I mean, what's left of the old 1967 West Bank is about 20%, and I think I'm being optimistic. So you've got, as I say, these communities forced into these little Bantustans. Now, as a South African, that is my reality. That has been my reality whenever I've traveled to the West Bank. And emotionally, yes, it does remind you of apartheid. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has said that. Ronnie Casuals has said that from the ANC. So many prominent human rights activists in South Africa have made exactly the same parallels that I have made.
Thank you so much, Shafiq. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps Ebrahim has something to add, particularly on that. So, Ebrahim, if you do have something that you wanted to add from your own experience on that, but also as we also discuss the region more generally speaking, because there are these axes that we've discussed sort of tangentially over the past hour. And my goodness, I can't believe that 45 minutes has passed already. We have so much that we could get through today. But I would like to ask you in particular about these different axes of power, as again you see them. First, in terms of how did you have anything like that during the anti-apartheid struggle, where there were these different axes that were supporting different sides within South Africa, and also how did you relate to that as you engaged during the Arab uprising years? Because you were talking earlier about how do you manage these contradictions, as it were. I suspect it was quite different when it came to the Arab world. But please, your thoughts, particularly on those axes, as well as if you have anything to add to these observations about what's actually happening within the Palestine question, particularly given all of these movements over recent months to normalize with Israel within the region, but also it seems normalizing the occupation.
No, thanks. And I would largely agree with Shafiq's analysis of what I would call the continuities between apartheid and Zionism as systems, what's happened in South Africa under apartheid and what's happening in Palestine under occupation. The continuities are largely in the area of shared suffering, the dispossession of the land, the dispossession of housing, and the removal of people from where they lived, the separation of people based on ethnicity and race and religion, the oppression of Palestinians. So those continuities are well established and maybe deserve the label by the United Nations of an apartheid situation in Palestine. And I think that if you want to find continuities on the suffering, then also look for continuities in the response to the suffering. And that's where I think, unfortunately, enormous discontinuities between apartheid in South Africa and the fight against it and the fight against Israel may have happened. And that's where intellectual laziness may have crept in and apartheid became a cliche. And so, for example, in South Africa, we had a fairly simple binary struggle. It was oppressed blacks versus a minority oppressor whites. I think sometimes what complicates the Palestinian situation is a trinary. You are having the restless and the oppressed needing relief. You have an unsustainable governance situation that Israel has to pay for and to maintain and to repress and to oppress. But then you always have the danger of an extreme. You always have the danger of the undesirable. And so the danger of the undesirable creates a unity around the unsustainable, the oppression. Secondly, the point that South Africa, out of its apartheid, it had a simple vision. It didn't confuse the world that we wanted a united, non-racial, democratic, non-sexist, and peaceful South Africa. That was our vision. We inspired the world with a simple vision of humanity. I think sometimes the Palestinians have a discontinuity because they try to make their divisions and fragmentations and ideological orientations and political orientations our problem as well. I've not heard a simple definition from Palestinians about what they want. I've heard debates, and maybe it's good, but the world needs to unite around a vision that can deal with both the oppressor and the perceived extreme around it. So what is that? There was a strategic coherence in the South African struggle. We had 4 pillars. The armed struggle was a part of it, but not the main part. I'm not saying I think that has changed, but it has created a moral inequivalence between the two struggles. And that's why the anti-apartheid movement globally was one of the largest ones, the successor to the Vietnam, the successor to the civil rights global movements and so forth, whereas we're struggling to find an equivalent one within. I think BDS is doing a good job, but I think that that's important. And then very importantly, South Africa was able to galvanize the African region through the African Union, the non-aligned movement from the moment of Bandung. We were able to unite all of that because we all had an anti-colonial interest. I think that what is happening in the kind of Middle East is the multiplicity of interests. There are some who are more afraid of Shias and of Iran than they are of Zionism and Israel. There are some who believe that we must, to get American support and Western support, we need to be friendly with Israel. And maybe the Palestinians must be sacrificed. There are some who are just so afraid that if a democratic state were to emerge in Palestine, that would ignite the germ for democracy, for human rights and freedom across the region and threaten the unsustainable authoritarian regimes across the region. And so there are such competing interests in the region, and a lot of these have theological underpinnings. So what is a regional contest in the Middle East is exported to us in South Africa, that we also are anti-Shia and get money to fight the Shias, when we know that the Saudis and the Emiratis and so forth don't fight Shiism because of a theological belief, but because of a regional dynamic. And so we get given the problem in a different way. So I would think that we must focus not just on the continuities in suffering, but we must also create continuities in strategy, tactics, and vision between Palestinians and what happened in the anti-apartheid struggle as a way to be able to move forward, because it's a complicated, complex region, competing interests, and a greater interest by Western imperialism to control that region, secure Israel, and to get the resources to flow. And therefore, that doesn't mean that one must give up, but it means one must have greater strategic wisdom. You must be challenged to get the best strategic political brains to think through that Palestinian struggle. And no country, no matter how noble the struggle, no people have the right to make their own mistakes. When we see those mistakes, we are all being drawn into some of those things.
So I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of interests, and that's something that I wanted Bell to touch on in particular, because again we've gone past this sort of tangentially over the past hour, and we're coming up to the end. We have only about 10 minutes left to this discussion, but I wanted you, Bell, to tell us something about those axes, and I think this is very important because you do have different axes of power in the region that didn't really exist in the same way at all prior to 2011. Indeed, probably not even prior to 2013 or even 2012. But these have become crystallized over particularly the past 5 years. The Egyptians and the Saudis and the Emiratis leading the poll on this side of the equation, and then the Turkish, Qatari, and their sorts of alliances on another pole, and then there's also the sort of much older axis of the Saudis leading the Sunni Arab states against Iran and its proxies in the region. I mean, there are all these different things that you have to keep in mind in order to try to understand how the region works. But I mean, that's one reading of the situation. Is that how you would look at it, or how do you see these different things affecting analysis and understanding of the region today?
I mean, absolutely. I would say there are sort of three axes at the moment that are directly impacting what's actually happening on the ground at the moment. One would be, as you mentioned, the sort of the traditional Saudi Gulf alliance that includes Egypt with the Emiratis. That's obviously playing a major role, as in they're actually bombing Yemen. But it's also taking a role in Libya. The UAE has played quite a huge role very recently, in supporting General Khalifa Haftar against the recognized Government of National Accord in Libya. So that's one axis. Then you've got Turkey, Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood, as you mentioned. They came to prominence, I think, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring, in terms of 2011, 2012 in Egypt, Tunisia. That has now morphed more into Turkey taking the lead in northern Syria, and also, of course, officially intervening in Libya. Also backing, Hamas in Gaza. And then the sort of third axis would be, in my opinion, the kind of Iranian axis. So you've got Iran-backed militias that are taking an increasingly powerful role in Iraq, that are obviously backing Bashar al-Assad in Syria with the Russians. And of course, where I am right now, which is in Beirut, playing quite a big role in supporting like Hezbollah. There is another sort of smaller axis there, I guess you could say, in terms of the Kurdish forces being backed by kind of the West, but that is something I think is thing on its own. So I'm going to focus on these three, and for me, these three axes have turned the region into a kind of international playground right now, and it's causing a big problem in terms of conflict resolution, because you have a situation now where territorial footholds gained in one country. So let's say, for example, Turkey and its affiliated forces with the Government of National Accord, literally taking ground in like Tahuna in Libya. That has a direct impact. That foothold gain has a direct impact and can be leveraged in northern Syria against the kind of Iran axis with Bashar al-Assad in northwestern Syria. So you have a situation where it is not really up to people within the countries themselves to alter their own destinies, but these axes using footholds in different parts of the region to be able to gain leverage in a conflict that might be thousands of kilometers away. And this, of course, it just means that it makes these conflicts incredibly difficult and very, very hard to resolve. It's very, very hard to come up with a peace deal. The other issue is it also means that there's a massive flood of quite sophisticated weapons, and that's something that I've noticed over the last few years in particular. If you take a country, for example, like Libya, back in the day, it was kind of warring fiefdoms of militias who were operating with pretty rudimentary, weapons. Sometimes they even made their own weapons, or whatever was left behind by Gaddafi, and they were fighting each other. There was, of course, always, foreign interference, but now, it's been massively upgraded. You've got frigates, you've got air defense systems, you've got drones, you've got a whole, weapon systems in place. The whole country is awash with weapons. And you also have foreign mercenaries. The UN said there's maybe 20,000 foreign fighters now fighting in Libya. So that's just one example that, of course, is being repeated in Syria as well, in terms of, the involvement from Iran and also Russia. And also in Yemen, the Houthis have missiles that are now capable of apparently reaching, Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So it's completely altering the landscape of the Middle East in terms of the conflict. And as I said, this basically makes conflict resolution very hard, particularly when within these axes, there's now beginning to be problems. So if you look, for example, on the Saudi-UAE axis, there's been situations where the forces that they have funded and trained within Yemen have ended up having a war among themselves. So you've got Saudi-backed interests and Emirati-backed interests actually fighting each other. And I'm talking about the Southern Separatists here, specifically the Southern Transitional Council. So you've now got a war within a war in Yemen that is not even related to the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011. In fact, Ali Abdullah Saleh is not even alive anymore. So you have in amongst those axes, you then have problems within them. And that just means in terms of civilians, people on the ground, which is, what I'm massively interested in as a journalist, humanitarian crises, is conflict resolution becomes impossible. And it is not up to the citizens themselves to alter their future, but these huge superpowers, whatever they see fit, whatever they believe is most in their interest, and they are leveraging footholds in Libya to make gains in Syria, or footholds in Yemen to make gains elsewhere, and that is causing, more wars and more conflict in the future. And unfortunately, we're involved in that. The UK, has sold a lot of weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia. We are not pushing back on that, and that is creating the conflicts of the future. Which we'll just have to see how that pans out, but it's not looking very very positive yet.
I mean, I'm very glad, Belle, that you bring up particularly Yemen, because I think that I don't like to say the word tragedy, because tragedy implies that it's sort of accidental. It's not. I mean, people made very clear decisions about what to do in Yemen, and it's been the people of Yemen that have suffered tremendously in a way that unfortunately I don't think we focus enough on, because it's a country that doesn't have resources that the West relies on. You don't have that sort of attention in the same way that you might have in other places. And I think that brings us to really the core point of this entire discussion, that beyond the slogans, beyond the machinations and the regional dynamics and so on, all of these things are important, but it's really the people on the ground, the individuals on the ground, those who suffered the most. They're the ones that really should be at the center of our calculations as analysts, as journalists, I'm sure, and as policymakers, because that's really where comprehensive security is to be found. When there's a fundamental layer that people can rely on just for their day-to-day lives, then that's really where you find stability. And if they don't have that, then instability is exactly what you have to come to expect. I would have liked very much to have continued this discussion for much longer than we've had. We've been on this for an hour. I myself had more questions that I wanted to pose, which I think means that we just need to arrange for a part 2 to this sort of discussion going forward. I want to thank all three of you really for having spared the time and the effort to speak to our audience today. Our audience is on our Carnegie website, is on Facebook, is on YouTube, and I know that we've had a lot of interest in this discussion beforehand, and even now, seeing that there are comments coming through. So I hope that we can continue this discussion, this conversation. I'm really pleased on behalf of Carnegie to have been able to welcome you, and I look forward to welcoming you all again in the future. Thank you very much. Have a good evening where you all are, and we hope to see all of you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.